Matt, thanks for coming for a windy and slightly grey walk in London. But really wanted to grab some time with you to talk about vulnerability in the workplace and how it's becoming much more prevalent, particularly in the Rec Hub.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Ben. Vulnerability, it's for me, it's one of those words that's meant a lot. It's meant a lot within my life, especially over the last sort of 10 years. And it's actually something that's been a huge passion of mine, and I guess a real big sort of internal journey, really. And so to be able to come to a brand like Rec Hub and I guess practice it first and foremost, but then work with the leadership team, the board, and all the employees within the Rec Hub is just fantastic.
In your previous roles, has that vulnerability and emotional working, has that kind of been discouraged?
Discouraged is a pretty strong word, isn't it?
Suppressed?
Suppressed, I think, is probably a more apt word. It's something that I've, again, through my own experiences of vulnerability and its practice, it's something that I've wanted to encourage in almost every single brand and business that I've been in. In terms of vulnerability itself, it's an incredibly scary practice. It's a very exposing practice of self. So for a lot of, I guess, business leaders, a lot of brands to want to take that practice on means that they're going to have to be fully sort of enveloped within that as well, and they're going to have to go along that journey for themselves as well. And that is something that I think a lot of business leaders, from my own experiences, are maybe not quite ready for.
Yeah, and I guess here at the Rec Hub, as a culture and our kind of cultural identity is one of vulnerability, and we obviously really look to build our culture from the ground up. As you know, we feel like culture can't be enforced, and that vulnerability of culture, that can't be enforced either. So I guess where we try and grow culture from the ground up, vulnerability kind of has to come on the flip side and come from the top down, right?
In some ways, yeah. Again, the analogy that you're using of the sort of top-down sort of analogy, sort of thesis, I guess. Actually, it's something we've talked about a lot, isn't it? We've sort of flipped the ownership or the leadership group to form the sort of foundation of the brand and business, which I think has been phenomenal. And actually, you know, heat rises. So when we're discussing things like vulnerability or love, honesty, you know, some of these practices, actually, if you can start that in the foundations of a brand and business, and that's the ownership or the leadership team or the board, and actually get that filtering up through an organisation, I think, from my own experiences and practices as well, employees are much more likely to understand it and want to implement it into their lives, of which work is part of their individual lives too.
So we're back after a quick rain delay.
Absolutely.
Back outside, classic British summertime.
No one would know.
No one will know. So we were talking about vulnerability in the workplace, and I guess holistically the concept of vulnerability is becoming a lot more prevalent in workplaces, but in reality, is the practice a lot more difficult? Is the implementation hard?
I think the word and the concept of vulnerability, as you're right, is becoming more and more prevalent. I think it's a concept that a lot of brands and a lot of people are quite interested in.
Yeah.
But the actual practice of it is something entirely different, and that's where I guess the issue truly lies, whether that's from a personal perspective or whether you're trying to implement it into a brand, so to say. And that's why, in terms of the work that the Rec Hub are doing and have allowed me, I guess, to do since I've been with you, it's that exploration and the practice of it day in, day out that ultimately builds the foundations of a brand. And I sort of hope you agree that, you know, since we've been exploring it and since we've been working on it pretty consistently, I guess the effect on performance has been quite profound. And that's what I found from an individual perspective as well, is that the more I bought into the practice of vulnerability, actually it opened up things for me in my life that I would never have known, never have found out about. And that's why it's so good, sort of practicing it for me every single day, and that's why it's really fun working with people in the brand now around that concept.
Definitely, and I think people within the Rec Hub have been very open to that. I think at first, naturally there was a scepticism or maybe a fear that it might lead to embarrassment or oversharing or potentially being too vulnerable, which again traditionally has been a negative, and it's been a negative connotation to be too vulnerable, right? You're seen as weak, you're seen as not very authoritative. But actually I think after that initial scepticism has gone, people have probably opened up far more than they were expecting to, which we have seen is increased performance.
100%, and you mentioned the word fear, and I think when people discuss vulnerability or the concept of vulnerability, that initial sort of guttural reaction is one of fear. So I think you're absolutely right about that. For me, in terms of that vulnerable practice, again, it's got to be consistent. You've got to be consistent within it. And the thing that I think the RecHub brand have done it amazingly well is that it started from the ownership and the leadership within the brand without them exploring it and practicing it day in, day out. And actually, it's not even buying into it, but it's actually understanding the benefits of it in terms of a life perspective, which of course work and personal is part of life. And the effect, I think, for employees has been, again, truly profound. But I think with vulnerability as well, it's one of those practices where everyone goes at a slightly different pace.
Yep.
And for me, it's about being patient and understanding and empathetic with everyone around the sort of pace that they want to go at. You know, some people, you open that door. I always talk about vulnerability being like the opening the door into self. And some people are just ready for it and just want to go sort of head first into that exploration of self. Whereas for others, it's a really sort of alien concept, and one where you've talked about fear and worry and anxiety when it comes to exploring what that means. So again, I'm very aware that for myself and for others, the pace that you want to explore that practice of vulnerability will differ from person to person. So just being really aware and understanding of that.
So I guess so far we've looked at kind of potentially the whys of vulnerability in the workplace, and it's been relatively more kind of theoretical.
Yeah.
So when we look at the actual hows and the implementation and kind of strategy versus action, how do we do it?
It's a great question, isn't it? It always comes down to the how. For me, the most important aspect of the practice of vulnerability is psychological safety. Psychological safety provides an individual or a group to actually explore what vulnerability really is to them or to a group. And again, that's something that we've worked really hard on, I think, within the RecHub, is to provide individuals and groups with that psychologically safe environment where they can explore the practice of vulnerability, which then opens up into other explorations, into maybe love or honesty, empathy. I mean, there's so many sort of feelings and emotions that once you start actually practicing and exploring these areas, just become so much more apparent. And again, I always use the words profound and enlightening.
Yep.
And for me, the exploration of vulnerability is incredibly profound and incredibly enlightening, and primarily in terms of the exploration of self. But then what that can then bring into a brand and a business is that connection throughout the brand and business, which is magnificent. And for me, if a brand and business wants to grow in a sustainable way, implementing those practices are just fundamental to its growth, its people growth, and I guess the overall culture of the organisation.
If a business is watching this and they want to explore vulnerability and they think it's a theme or a narrative that could really benefit the people within their business, what is the starting point? How do we start being more vulnerable?
It's another amazing question. You talked about fear earlier. It's vulnerability for me. The practice of vulnerability is really the step into the unknown. And the unknown is something that terrifies a lot of people because we've been brought up in, especially I guess within the Western world, an environment and a society that's quite confined, it's quite boarded off. And to go and explore something like vulnerability, it is literally taking that, it's like standing still and taking that first step step into the unknown. I often talk about it in terms of on an individual basis, turning the first page of your book. How often do we even think about doing that, let alone actually doing it? So if a business actually wants to explore what vulnerability really is, I think the owners of that business have to go and introspect or be prepared to open the first pages of their book as well. Which is why I guess there's so few businesses and people that actually go and do it. But for me, the ones that do go and do that and who do want to go and step into the unknown and see what vulnerability truly brings to themselves and a brand or business, for me will be the brands and the people that excel moving forward in terms of performance and culture.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time. That's been
my
amazing.
pleasure. It's been amazing.